Welcome to Shellphone, the podcast that gives the ocean its very own hotline. Join us as we hear from ocean stewards, discover threats to ocean health, and learn ways we can all answer the ocean's call. This podcast is brought to you by Breach the Surface and Coastal Creative. I'm Harmony Dawson, and joining us this episode is Jessica Pate. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm glad we were able to work out a time to talk. Before we get into the episode, can you introduce everyone to yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah, so my name is Jessica Pate, and I founded the Florida Manta Project with the Marine Megafauna Foundation. And the Florida Manta Project is basically the first dedicated project of manta rays in Florida. So before I started this project, basically nothing was known about manta rays. So sometimes people are like, what do you study about manta rays? And I'm like, pretty much everything, because there's so many unknowns. Yeah. And we even recently expanded our research to guitarfish. So we just keep on finding poorly studied rays and trying to learn more about them.
Awesome. That was one of the things that really interested me when getting ready for this episode. I was watching some other webinars that you've done, and you mentioned that not much was known about manta rays when you first started the project. And that seems surprising for how charismatic of an animal they are.
Yeah, I mean, they're a very popular animal. People will travel halfway across the world to go diving with them. And I think part of the reason they went unnoticed for so long is that divers don't see them on the reefs here, which is unusual. A lot of times they're engaged in what's called like cleaning behavior, where they go on the reef and the little reef fish will clean all the parasites off their body. But we don't see that here. I always say you're more likely to see a manta ray in Florida walking on the beach than you are diving on the reef, because they're in super shallow water very close to shore.
So the first thing that we're going to talk about is just all things manta ray. I know there's probably a lot that we won't be able to cover today, but starting basic, what are manta rays? What types of different rays are there, and how are these different from those?
Yeah, so a lot of times what I'll get when I ask people if they know what a manta ray is, they'll be like, yeah, that's what killed Steve Irwin. And I'm like, no, incorrect. So manta rays do not have a stinging barb, and they live very different lives from stingrays. So stingrays you're going to see like on the seafloor, buried in the sand. And manta rays have to keep swimming in order to breathe. So you're always going to see them swimming. They have these big diamond-shaped black bodies with these unique fins that come out of their head called cephalic fins that they use to help them eat. And then they're just really, really, really big. Like the biggest mantas can get up to 6 to 7 meters, which is well over 20 feet.
I also know that when they are born, they're very big as well already.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things here is we have a population of juveniles here in South Florida that I started studying. And, I'll be talking to fishers on piers, and they'll be like, I saw this enormous manta ray. And I'll be like, it was probably like a baby. And they're like, no, you don't understand. It was so big. And I'm like, they're born at 6 feet across. And they're like, oh, okay. So like even the ones we're seeing at like 10 to 12 feet across are often juveniles. So they can get really, really massive.
Where can you find manta rays geographically, but also habitat-wise?
Yeah, so geographically, they are in the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans. I don't know if we want to get into the different kinds of species, but there are 2, possibly 3 species of manta ray. So yeah, they're mostly found in tropical areas, but they also can be found in Florida's subtropical and even temperate. Like we have mantas along the U.S. East Coast that are found up off the coast of New York. So they have these wide ranges. Habitat-wise, you'll see a lot around reefs. There's one species that's called the reef manta. They're often found on reefs where they have those cleaning stations. So what they'll do is they'll kind of hang out at the cleaning stations during the day, and then they'll go off into deeper waters and feed at night.
Yeah. And they get really close to shore, right? You said that a lot of them are seen right from the beach.
Here in Florida, that's what we see. That's seen some other places, but not others. But yeah, here in Florida, we'll see them with basically I've seen their wing like flap basically on the sand. They've been in like 2 feet of water.
Next, I'd like to talk about what they eat and how they eat their food.
Yeah, so manta rays are filter feeders. So even though there's these like really big creatures, they're eating the little tiny stuff in the ocean. So like little crustaceans, shrimp, copepods. And once they find an area that's full of what's called zooplankton, they will unroll their cephalic fins and move through the water. And then all the water goes into their mouth. Their gills have these feather like structures that capture all the plankton in them. So their gills act like a filter, catch all the zooplankton, and then they swallow it. And that's how they eat. So it's more similar to how like a big baleen whale eats than to a lot of other rays.
There's a couple points off of that I'd also like to talk about. One is related to the intentional catching of manta rays and how that relates to the structures that they use to eat and the trade of that. We had a recent episode that talked about the shark fin trade in Indonesia. And in the webinar from you that I was watching, you kind of mentioned something similar with rays. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Manta rays are globally endangered, and the main reason that their populations are declining is fishing. So they can be caught as bycatch. They're caught as bycatch in the U.S. shrimp fishery, which I'm beginning to study, but they're also targeted. They can be targeted for their meat. They can also be targeted for their gills or their gill plates. So those are those structures in their gills that kind of catch all the plankton. Basically, in the 90s, a market started. So these gill plates are dried and kind of sold as this cure-all tonic, and they can go for hundreds of dollars per kilogram. So, if a fisherman before this caught a manta and they weren't going to eat it, they'd probably just let it go. But if you catch one and now you know that manta's worth like thousands of dollars, you're more likely to keep it. So this has been driving a lot of the worldwide population declines in manta rays, is this fishing and this international trade.
So the other related point that I wanted to talk about has to do with the ingestion of microplastics. Since they eat such small food, microplastics can easily be included in with that. Can you talk a little bit about that and what kind of threat or what level of threat that poses to mantas?
So basically, like you said, when plastic breaks down into the ocean, like plastic never really goes away, it just breaks down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And so some of these pieces are the same size as the food. And one of my colleagues in Indonesia found that manta rays are consuming up to like 60 pieces of plastic per hour. And the thing is, we don't really know overall how it's affecting the mantas. This could cause like blockages in their digestive system. If they consume enough, they could be leaching toxins into their body. So it's a line of research that needs more work. Really, that's the only study in Indonesia that's really been done on it. So work in some other places should be conducted as well. But I feel like every time I turn on the news, we have like microplastics in our brain and our blood, even just in humans. So it's everywhere and it's disturbing.
Yeah, it's hard to escape from. I feel like I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but another really interesting thing that I heard or found while preparing for this episode is that the size of their brains is very large relative to their body size and how that could be related to their social behavior. Can you talk a little bit about that and what their behavior is like in general, or how often they're seen in groups or anything around that topic?
mantas have the largest brain to body size ratio of any fish, which basically means, we talked about how big they are, but they don't just have a big brain because their body is big. They have a big brain for their body size. Like, say, if you look at their cousin, the whale shark, which is 10 times the size of a manta ray, they have about a third of the brain size as a manta ray. So they're very cute, but maybe not as smart. And, similar to us humans, we have a very large brain to body size ratio. And that's, they think, a lot because of our complex social lives. We have to remember all this information and faces. So mantas are also quite social. They can be social when they feed. At a place in the Maldives, hundreds of reef mantas will get together and kind of cooperatively feed. They basically make like a plankton tornado by swimming around in circles. And they show curiosity to divers, which is, something divers are, usually if like a fish hasn't been fed or something like that, most fish don't want anything to do with you. But mantas are known to kind of like come by divers and kind of just see what's up. And yeah, so this might all be signs of their intelligence. Another avenue for future research would be manta ray social behavior. There's still a lot to learn and a lot we don't understand.
That seems like a very common thread of there being things where we need to research them more to know more, and that hasn't been done yet. And that kind of goes into how the Florida Manta Project started. Can you talk about that and what kind of inspired this project and what the goals of it are?
Yeah, so this project kind of happened pretty happenstance. I had moved to Florida after my undergrad degree, and I was working on sea turtle nesting beaches. And what that involves is driving up and down the beach all day on an ATV, counting turtle tracks. So I was always out on the beach, and sometimes I would like look over in the ocean and I would see a manta ray swimming by, and I was just like, we have manta rays in Florida and no one's talking about it. Like, I did Google searches, nothing came up. Even if you did Google Scholar searches and looked at the science, there was like one article from the 90s saying that like 3 mantas were seen. And then the rest of it is old fishing stories where people would go out and harpoon mantas at the beginning of the 20th century. So I was very surprised that they were there. And I used to like carry my fins and my mask on the back of my ATV and like try to swim out to them in the middle of my survey. And I was never successful because it's hard to do. But I finally convinced one of my friends to take me out on his boat. And we actually found a manta the first day we went looking for one. And it did this behavior where it flipped upside down and looked at me, which I've now had done a lot of times, but it just kind of just like hovered below me, like looking me in the eye. And I was like, what on earth? And I just was mesmerized and kind of hooked. But then I tried to study mantas for grad school. Long story short, it didn't happen. It probably took me 7 years before I actually started the Florida Manta Project. And then, like, our first question we wanted to answer are there enough mantas to study in Florida? Because I talked to a lot of, shark scientists and divers, and everyone was like, not really. So, but it was just something I always wanted to try. So on my days off for my full-time job, my boyfriend and I would rent a boat and go look for mantas. And luckily we found that there were enough to study, and, everything kind of snowballed from there. We started that first year of looking for mantas in 2016. In 2018, mantas were listed on the Endangered Species Act, but they were listed on the Endangered Species Act based of all that fishing I told you about earlier that's mostly happening in the Indo-Pacific. But they basically didn't know anything that was happening here in the Atlantic or Gulf of Mexico. So we've been doing a lot of work with the federal government to work on Endangered Species Act protections, make sure, the data is updated, because basically before the Endangered Species Act, none of the bycatch in US fisheries for rays was identified as species. It was just like, it's a ray. So before that, there's really There's some data, but it's really bad. So up until 2020, we didn't have data really on manta ray bycatch. And now that they're collecting data, we're seeing that lots of mantas are getting caught, especially in the shrimp fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico, but also in longlines and other fisheries as well.
For those who may not be familiar, can you describe what the Endangered Species Act is?
Yes, if it's still around in the next 4 years, it's a really depressing time to be involved in conservation. Yeah, so I'm trying to think, is it 1973? I don't know if I'm making that up.
I'm not sure.
We can
Let's
pause this
see.
part. Sometimes I don't know if
Even if it's not like
it
a
is. It's
concrete,
1973. I was right.
great memory.
So the Endangered Species Act was established in 1973, basically as a way to recover endangered species from the brink of extinction. And so it's been highly successful with animals like bald eagles were one, alligators in Florida were another, manatees were one, although they had a big setback recently. Sawfish were looking like they were going to be one of the success stories, but they've also suffered a recent setback. But so the Endangered Species Act basically provides a framework to recover these populations from the brink of extinction. It's a very important act and has been very successful.
Great, thank you. So, part of that establishing a basis for their status under the Endangered Species Act has to do with identifying critical habitat for the manta rays. Can you talk about what you've found that critical habitat to look like here in Florida? And I know that it is mostly for young mantas. Can you talk about that as well?
Yeah, so I don't know if you really want to make the distinction in this podcast between what NOAA describes as critical habitat, which is something super, super specific and we have not done yet. And it's a long way off in the future. Or we can talk about critical habitat in the more like ecological sense, is that it's an area important for an animal's survival, which is probably the better way to talk about that. So these can be areas like reproductive areas or nursery habitats for juveniles or places where they eat. So, in the area of South Florida, where I do most of my work, kind of off Palm Beach County, we found almost exclusively juvenile manta rays here. So, these are the young babies. They're anywhere from like 6 to 12 feet. And we see the same individuals over and over, year after year. We usually see them for maybe 2 to 3 years, and then we don't see them anymore. So this is all evidence that this is an important nursery habitat, which is a place where young mantas can like safely grow up before moving on to their adult habitats.
What methods do you use to conduct surveys to conduct surveys on the manta rays?
So we do, I would say the majority of our work with boat surveys. So we'll go out on a boat. We used to do it by just like, I would stand on the bow and just visually look for manta rays. Now we've become a little more technologically savvy and we use drones to help us find manta rays. We don't only use them to find manta rays, we use them to study manta rays. I was just on a meeting right before this where a PhD student is using drone video data to kind of look at the effect of divers in the waters with manta rays. When we find them, we get in the water with them. We use underwater photography to identify individuals because each individual has a unique spot pattern that's just like a fingerprint. So I see these spots. I know that that manta is named Gilly, and then we can track him over time. We also will measure them. We have a device that's has paired lasers. So it has two lasers, underwater lasers, that sit about half a meter across with a camera in the middle. So we go film that. And then when we can see the lasers on the animal in the video, we know that they're half a meter apart and we can measure the rest of the manta ray. We have a lot of methodology. We also do aerial surveys and small planes. We do satellite and acoustic tagging. We will do genetics once we collect enough data. So there's quite a lot.
That's awesome. I was recently at an event where I attended a talk about whales in Florida, and they talked about how drones were being used to actually deploy tags. So drones are definitely making their way into the conservation scene in a lot of different ways.
The whale people have very, very fancy drones. Ours
Yeah.
are not quite that advanced.
You mentioned another thing that really interested me, which is using the spots on their bellies to identify the individuals. And that's one question that I really wanted to figure out with today's episode because I know that with animals like manatees, they usually identify them by the scars that are left from boating incidents. And I know that manta rays also have a lot of boating incidents that happen, but the scars left behind heal much better and more quickly than on manatees. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we found that in South Florida, about 8% of our manta rays have been hit by a boat. And those are just the manta rays that have survived for us to see that they've been hit by a boat. It's very rare to find a dead manta ray. They sink when they stop swimming and they're made of cartilage, so they decompose really rapidly. So finding dead mantas outside of fishing markets is extremely rare. But yeah, they have really amazing healing properties. The first time I saw it was actually a manta I mentioned earlier named Gilly. And I remember being able to see just this wide gash. I could see it from the boat where the propeller had hit him. And I was absolutely horrified. But that was a manta we saw a lot this one. Actually, one year I pretty much studied Gilly the manta. He was one of the only mantas that was showing up. But we saw him again like 4 days later, and the wound had almost completely closed. So I was just in shock when I saw that. So it's really cool that they're able to heal so well. But if anything, it means they heal really well. So the scars sometimes are hard to see. So if anything, the amount they're hit by boats, we are underestimating since the scars can be hard to see and we only see the ones that are surviving.
Yeah.
Yeah, if anyone wants to go to my Instagram, they can see lots of sad mantas hit by boats.
Yeah. I was kind of debating like whether or not to talk more about that topic or if we could go on to like slightly less depressing things. But there is a lot of really good media that comes out of your project of from like drone footage and stuff like that. So I would also definitely recommend people to check that out.
Which is an important thing that I learned from one of my mentors, Andrea Marshall, because I never thought that way when I started out about how important it is to document everything and not just to document it, but to like document it beautifully. Because if you can get these like beautiful, compelling photographs that really tell a story, it can make such a difference in your ability to communicate to the public what the problem is. So if there's any new scientists out there, kind of always be thinking about like how you can like visually communicate your project to somebody.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that as I've gotten into this field, and it seems that people are kind of branching out in how much and what form they're sharing about their research topics or things like that, which is part of the reason why we have this podcast. But yeah, my next question has to do with how the community and citizen science and just community outreach in general, what that has to do with the work that you do.
Yeah, so Citizen science has been a huge part of our work. We probably get a couple hundred reports of manta sightings around the state each year. And a good example of how they've been used to help us is during the COVID pandemic, during the lockdown that we had here. All of a sudden, I got this rise in reports of manta rays in canals down in like Miami and Fort Lauderdale. So these canals can be like miles away from the ocean. And mantas were in there feeding. Sometimes they'd be in there for a couple of days. And I had no idea mantas were using these habitats. And I think it was because everyone was stuck at home and people were just out on their condo porches looking down and they would see these manta rays. But that basically this year we've started a whole new aerial survey to go look in those areas for manta rays because of those citizen science reports. So, especially with like endangered species that can be hard to find and are rarely encountered, citizen science is so important. I'm actually writing a paper on like manta ray cousins called devil rays right now, and about half of that data is from citizen science. So it's incredibly important.
In the same vein, if you were to come across a manta ray in the wild, how would you recommend interacting or more so not interacting with it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on how you encounter it. We never recommend like chasing the manta ray or anything. Basically, let the manta ray dictate the encounter. If they're curious about you, like you could be on a paddleboard or something, and they might circle you. But just enjoy the rare occurrence of seeing a beautiful manta ray, and please take a picture because I cannot trust any citizen science sightings without a photo because despite us having signs on fishing piers with how to identify a manta ray, still about half our sightings reports are not manta rays. So we always need a photo to make sure we're talking about the same thing.
Would you say that manta rays are easy to identify, or if not, like what are some tips for that?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think they're easy to identify. It depends what you're comparing them to. But what I found a lot from talking to people is they think of rays as just all one thing. It's really interesting, like psychologically. And it's why I'm trying to like work on this outreach to be like, actually, these rays are very different than these rays, but they're big, they're black, which can also describe in Florida a spotted eagle ray. So those are similar. And the best way to tell those apart is spotted eagle rays have a pointy face. They have kind of like a beak that they eat things with. And manta rays are going to have those kind of white fins that come out of the front of their face. And then if you happen to see a cousin of the manta ray, which are the devil rays, you just need a photo because those can be trickier.
I also wanted to ask about what kind of challenges you face in your work, whether that's on the research side of it, where there might be issues out in the field, or on the other end with publishing work or working with communities, anything under the sun.
There's a lot of challenges under the sun. I mean, my whole entire life is weather dependent. As you have learned by me rescheduling this meeting, field work is all weather dependent. So I usually don't make my schedule until a week in advance when I know what the weather is going to be. And then, kind of working in a small organization where our Florida Manta Project team is incredibly tiny, it's kind of having to like wear a lot of different hats. You're wearing the scientist hat, but you also have to be able to drive a boat and fly a drone and analyze your data and raise money and write grants and do all the education and outreach. So sometimes it's just a lot of stuff to keep all going in the air. Sometimes I'm like, I wish I could just be like, focus on the field work and do all that. And that's all I do. But, it keeps you fresh and challenged.
So, would you say then that being out in the field is your favorite part?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%.
What does like a perfect field day look like? And what's the process like?
Yeah, so a perfect field day is we leave the marina, we get out on the ocean, and it's glassy smooth. So, not a wave in sight. We'll probably see some dolphins. I mean, ideally, we would see like a hammerhead shark from the drone as well. And then we find manta rays in clear water, because a lot of times they're in murky water, that are friendly. So, a lot of times mantas don't want to have anything to do with us. So, but if they're friendly, it makes everything easy. I don't feel bad. That's my perfect field day. There are certain days when the ocean is just full of life. Like you'll be bait balls and dolphins and lots of sharks and schools of jacks. And other times it's kind of like, it's kind of quiet out here. What's going on? So those days where it's just like the ocean is full of life, those are just like the best times to be out there.
What does an unfriendly manta ray look like? Is it just like them swimming away? Also, kind of related, how fast can they swim
I don't know
relatively?
a specific number for how fast they can swim, but you can't keep up with them if you wanted to. They can swim faster than you, 100%. So if they don't want anything to do with you, they can get away. And they'll usually just kind of go offshore into deeper water if they don't want anything to do with you. Yeah, so that's what an unfriendly manta works like. And if that's what we're dealing with, we try to like minimize the harassment, just get an ID shot and leave it alone, which we've gotten much better at over time.
Yeah, I imagine you started the project in 2019, was it? Or,
2016.
oh, okay. So not quite. But I imagine there's been lots of changes and improvements and different strategies over that time.
Yeah, and it's a lot of the stuff that you can't teach people because it's just like when I'm in the water with the manta ray, I can kind of sense what they're going to do, and it's you can't really explain it to anybody because it's a case by case basis, and the only way you learn this stuff is just hundreds of hours in the water looking at these creatures.
Awesome. Those are all of the topics that I wanted to make sure we got to. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about or a favorite thing about manta rays that you'd like to share? Anything extra?
I mean, I think you covered a lot of my favorite manta facts. When I was starting out as a scientist, like reading Jane Goodall's books and about her research, about like getting to know like a population of animals super intimately was always very appealing to me, and just studying them over a long period of time and really like understanding them. And that's kind of what I want to do with the mantas here. And it's cool because, like her, I get to know my individuals, but what's sad is they're juveniles. So I get to know them and then they leave. Like, I think this was the last year. Probably I'm going to see lizard and cricket. I will probably cry if they come back next year, but I don't think they will. So it's always like a little, we get new mantas in that become our favorites, and then the others leave and go off to become adults. And it's a little sad and nostalgic.
That kind of brought up another question. How long do manta rays live, and how many years of that are they considered juveniles?
That is a great question. We don't have perfect answers to those questions. We think they're living around 50 years. The longest one has been photo ID'd, was in Australia over a 40-year period. How long they are juveniles, we don't really know. We think males probably mature around 5 years, females 8 to 10, but it probably depends on species and where they are. So, like, what is happening here in Florida is still to be determined.
That's expected, as that's been like a theme throughout the conversation. I'd also like to end on a bit of a point of hope, or at least what you see like coming for the future, since there's lots of things that could drag down that picture of the future. Do you have any spots of hope that you're kind of holding on to with the mantas, or conservation, or your own work, or what do you envision doing over the next few years?
Well, I think my big spots for hope are, so say, for example, I grew up in rural North Carolina. I didn't know anything about environmentalism or climate change when I was growing up. Like I was just completely ignorant of these issues. And now I talk to 5-year olds and they know about microplastics and climate change and saving energy and all of this stuff. It's kind of just like part of their worldview. And I think it's really going to come down to them to make sure things really get changed. And I feel like we're just holding down the fort and making sure nothing gets too bad until that happens.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, anyway, I think we've talked about a lot. There's definitely a lot more to learn about manta rays, and I'm really glad that we got the chance to have you in for an episode, so thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful talking.
Thanks for tuning into Shellphone. To learn more about our projects, suggest a guest, or donate to the show, visit our website at breachthesurface.org or social media at breachthesurface and at Shellphone Podcast. To learn more about Jessica and the Florida Manta Project, visit at Marine Megafauna and at Florida Manta Girl on Instagram, or the Marine Megafauna Foundation website at marinemegafauna.org. Whether you're listening in on Spotify, YouTube, or another podcast streaming platform, follow us or leave a comment to let us know that you enjoyed the show. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.